Good afternoon. I welcome you all to an important speaker on an important topic. We have Dr. Ethisam Ahmad with us. Ehtisham is a visiting senior fellow at London School of Economics, and he is a senior fellow of ZEF. He has various other affiliations, and he was a former senior advisor of the IMF. Ehtisham is a globally involved economist and the author of many very important and often cited books. For demonstration purposes, I put this one, which stands alone and doesn't need to hold it. It's the new Handbook of Multilevel Finance. This new handbook, Ehtisham will inform you about and selectively talk about it. Let me just say a few words. Why we at ZEF are so interested in issues of decentralization, political, administrative, and fiscal decentralization. Apparently there is a trend going on. Since the early 1990s, at least 80 countries have changed their legal setup. Some have changed their constitutions to further decentralize. Is this trend applaudable? Is it going in the right directions? Is it going too fast, too deep? Those are critical, practical development policy questions. At what layer, at what level of government, what should be done to serve citizens with services? The taxation issues, so we shouldn't just look at spending, are absolutely critical and addressed in key chapters in this book. Ehtisham, I think you will also talk about where does all this come from? What's the theory behind it? The history of decentralization has been strongly influenced by the United States Constitution. Many have copied from there. You probably will not go too deep into that, but it should be noted. The whole notion how we look at governments, I think, has changed from normative to more positive political economy analysis. The book also looks at these big issues. I think anyone who wants to work interdisciplinary work on economics, on sociology, and also on the natural resource aspects of development cannot bypass the role of governments at different levels and trying to find ways so that government is efficient and effective and serves its citizens, and citizens have a chance to influence government appropriately. Ehtisham, you are affiliated with ZEF as a senior fellow since many years, and that shall continue. Thank you for being here again, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you. Let's welcome Ehtisham. I will circulate that so that some people can read.
Thank you very much, Joachim, for that excellent introduction. Thank you also for your very valuable contribution to this volume. It's an excellent chapter by Joachim and Regina Berner on a key issue of interest to development economists. What effect does decentralization have on poverty reduction? So that's a very key question that I think a lot of us ask. And indeed, you know, one of the reasons why we did this book was to ask important policy questions. So really, I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, and then I'm also going to talk about some interesting research questions, which I hope will interest some of you, hopefully, and provide the basis for thinking about future work together. So the motivation for the volume was to look at, as Joachim pointed out, positive approaches to decentralization. It's to look at what changes in terms of recommendations to public policies if you have changes in institutional arrangements and differences across countries in multi-level incentive effects. And I think these are the two key issues which lead to variances in policy prescriptions that are actually rather important. And a thing to keep in mind is quite often the theoretical developments lag what countries actually can end up doing. I'm going to talk a little bit about why that happens. Of course, you know, in the post-Second World War period, a lot of countries were affected by the United States with the US-centric view of decentralization. The question really is that when we started looking at applying the decentralized approaches in a number of countries, including especially in China, in the early 1990s, we found that a lot of the US-centric recommendations were not relevant. I'll talk a little bit about why that was the case. And again, there's been a lot of research where models drawn from, for example, from Europe, Bismarckian social insurance, is seen not to work in countries where you have a lot of informality. So the question is, again, institutions at multi-levels and incentive effects may make recommendations which work in some countries, may work in Germany, may work in the United States, may not work in China, may not work in Africa. So typically, what one wants to look at are tax and social policies coming together, giving responsible outcomes or not, as the case may be in different contexts, whether it's Ethiopia or it's Indonesia. We're discussing these issues this morning with some colleagues. So really what one wants to focus on is careful assessments of country experience, and then thinking through what is implied if you are interested in sustainable development. For example, in the Mexican case, you want to look at how taxes and transfers, how informality and the incentives to cheat affect public policies. And the Mexican case is extremely interesting because they've had a major reform in the last couple of years, which is perhaps not as extensive as the Chinese reform in 1993, but the most advanced set of reforms in any developing country. And then, of course, there's the issue of what do you do with sustainable development. It's a question of sustainable urban hubs. How do you determine them? How do you move towards sustainable growth that addresses issues of the middle income trap? Of course, there's work on China, there's work on Chile, extensions to India and other cases, and we'll talk a little bit about how incentives, how investments, and financing at different levels of government are necessary to be brought together if you're thinking about a sustainable development agenda. So I'll talk first about some broad lessons from the handbook, talk a little bit about a research project we have had in the last year, couple of years on Mexico and Indonesia, which is tax and social policy in the presence of informality, talk a little bit about addressing inequality, sustainable development, and financing of urban infrastructure, and then talk about key multi-level issues. Poverty reduction is one of the main focus of attentions in an institution like this. You really need to know how multi-level finance affects poverty reduction, how public policies are subject to capture and clientelism and cheating, how you address natural disasters, how do you address environmental concerns, how do you handle revenue sharing in countries where revenues are concentrated in, say, certain parts of the country, as in Indonesia, or in the Middle East. And then, of course, you have the whole very wide range of issues relating to conflict prevention and resolution. And here the issues we have been working on, like Iraq and Yemen, personally involved in these cases, in Latin America's Colombia, plus other Mexico. There are important issues on using multi-level finance to address conflict. So I'll talk a little bit about these issues. So that's the agenda for today. So what are some lessons that we can draw from the handbook? And Joachim correctly pointed to the positive approaches to multi-level finance. These go back to Adam Smith and the discussions leading to the US Constitution. So really you start off with the political economy approaches, the genesis of which goes back 200 years. But there's been a huge expansion of the literature in the last 10 years. And that's reviewed by Lockwood and Breton, and a seminal paper by Pierre Salmon, who actually was the first person to talk about yardstick competition in the 1950s, who then picked up by Besley and Case in their 1993 paper, which was then a formalization of the issues of yardstick competition in terms of getting good outcomes. Ravelli is talking about a very important issue of spatial constraints in decentralization, what he calls the geographical federalism issues. Congleton talks about asymmetric federalism, and Spahn, a paper on contract federalism. So then we get to the meat of the public policy questions. There are policies and instruments and institutions. Who does what? Excellent paper by Bernard Daflon. I talk about governance and institutions, both on the revenue side and the spending side. Revenue assignments and accountability by Bordignon and Ambrosano. Tax competition is a key issue by Wilson. Below the Salt is a fabulous paper on the problems of assigning the VAT amongst different levels of government. This is quite often a solution, as mentioned. It is in operation in India, in Brazil, in Canada. These are options that countries perhaps want to avoid. And Richard Byrd does an excellent job in addressing this set of issues. Financing urban areas, particularly metropolitan areas. Roy Ball and Johannes Lind have a nice paper. And then Jorge Martinez Vasquez reviews local and subnational taxes. Then, of course, there's a masterly paper by Bordway on transfer design issues, the theories, and the practical issues, then macro sustainability. And then we have the emerging challenges in terms of capture and clientelism, poverty reduction by Joachim and Regina, sharing of natural resources and the potential of conflict that arises by Barroso, then environmental and climate change, natural disasters, conflict prevention. And then, very important, very, very important, how do you measure decentralization? This is something which people assume that they know what they're talking about when they look at numbers from the IMF, or they get national numbers, which mixes up central operations at local levels, as well as operations carried out by local governments on their own behalf. So quite often when people use data, which reflects, or they think that it reflects decentralization, they pick up a lot of nonsense. So you have to be very careful how you define decentralization. Excellent paper by Blöchlinger of the OECD. And he's the head of a network that I helped establish 10 years ago, the OECD Network on Intergovernmental Relations. And I can tell you that OECD countries had difficulty in producing good numbers on decentralized operations. Forget about countries like Pakistan or India or Indonesia. So this is a big problem. So let's talk a little bit about normative approaches. Normative approaches were largely driven by the US experience after the Second World War. It was also partly politically motivated because the United States was interested in replicating the US model in Germany and other parts of the world. This is the way things should be done. It's normative. It was also popularized by Musgrave. Very clear definitions about who should be doing what. And then, of course, in the European context, the principle of subsidiarity have very clear definitions as to who should be doing what. Very prescriptive. Education to the lowest levels. Financing certain types of taxes to local governments. So really what you had was a US-centric model, but it was a US-centric model that often didn't work elsewhere. So, you had country after country talking about giving primary and secondary education to the lowest level of government, and then central government supposed to be addressing spillovers through earmark grants. But in country after country, neither of these things worked. And the question is why? Quite often it was because local governments did not have own source revenues. This is own source revenues over which they had own control. So the Nigerian constitution in the late 1990s gave primary education to the municipalities. The municipalities had no own source revenues. Didn't have sources of financing primary education. So they got a transfer from the central government. They didn't pay the teachers because it wasn't enough. It was only enough to finance the mayor and his cars. Wasn't enough to pay the teachers. They didn't pay the teachers. What happened? They didn't pay the teachers. And of course, teachers go on strike very quickly. And the function was withdrawn. So that's what happens if you give an inappropriate assignment to a level of government that can't handle it, or doesn't want to handle it, doesn't have the means to handle it, didn't have the incentives to handle it. Indonesia, big bang decentralization, gave education, healthcare to local governments. And no own source revenues apart from what comes from Jakarta, so these shared revenues. Of course, you have no own source revenues, you get spending responsibilities, whether you would use these monies efficiently or not is an open question. And this is something that some of you are looking at, and there's a fear that it wasn't handled properly. So there is a recognition of externalities in countries in Latin America that have pushed down education to the municipal level are withdrawing. Colombia, Mexico, picking it up because their externalities, standards are falling. This is affecting their competitive position. So really, the issue of having pushed down accountability to the lowest level continues in countries like Pakistan, which is very much influenced by private sector involvement in the US model. But is it working, is the question. So really that was the issue. So one needs to focus on incentives and institutions. So as I said, a number of papers address these issues. Lockwood, Ravelli, Breton, Salmon, Barton, and Mukherjee talk about the issues of incentives and distributions, how and why policies are designed and implemented, and then looking at the interactions between institutions and implementation. Yardstick competition is needed to ensure that the outcomes are effective, but yardstick competition doesn't work without two conditions. One is that there must be own source revenues at the margin so that the voters of a locality or jurisdiction are able to measure the costs of what they provide as they are borne by themselves. Plus, you need the information. You need the information on who spends what at different levels of government on a standardized basis so that the neighbors are able to compare how they're doing. Quite often this doesn't exist. And then, of course, you may have capture or clientelism. And clientelism, of course, as I said, reflects old debates in the Federalist Papers. Are there factions that will capture the benefits of certain public policies? And cheating and informality is a reflection of capture and clientelism. So you may end up getting asymmetric arrangements and contracts, but asymmetric arrangements and contracts require a lot of information. So you need public financial management requirements, which may not exist even in the OECD countries, to have asymmetric arrangements. Before countries go down that route, as indeed Indonesia has the asymmetric arrangements. You need to make sure you have the public financial management and reporting requirements, which Indonesia doesn't have. So there are problems which are possibly built up on the recognition, particularly recognition and monitoring of liabilities and outcomes. So, one of the first problems we saw with the, at least personally, I was involved in the discussions in China in the late 80s and early 90s, was that the choice of instruments and sequencing of measures that were suggested by the normative approaches didn't apply in the Chinese case. And an example of that was the discussion we were having in early 1992 to 1993 with the Chinese government. The World Bank was telling the Chinese, first fix your state-owned enterprises, fix your spending requirements, then once you have done that, we'll come to the tax agenda. Chinese said no. That's not what is relevant for us, but we are going to start with the revenue side first, because that gives us the ability to manage the economy, gives us the ability to redistribute, which at that stage they didn't have, because the Deng Xiaoping reforms had led to a collapse in central government revenues, which were appropriated by the states and local governments. Central government didn't have a tax policy capability, didn't have a tax administration. So the focus of the Chinese 1993 reforms was on taxes and transfers, not spending. It turned around the recommendations of the normative approach to a very political economy solution, which is now recognized in the literature, but it wasn't recognized in the literature when the Chinese did it. So they were in advance, as I said, sometimes in advance of what the international agencies and the theory was telling them. So quite often countries know what's right for them, and the international agencies don't. So this is something just to keep in mind, because the theory sometimes comes at the expense of reality. So really, this was an excellent example of the political economy approach. The solution was to make sure that no province loss, with stop-loss provision to enable provinces to agree to giving up their tax powers. Then they had a sharing of the VAT revenue to be brought in for the first time, so that the rich provinces got more. And then they had an equalization system to ensure that everyone would benefit, including the poorest provinces. And then, this was the most controversial, they gave back money to the rich coastal areas. And the World Bank went bananas. They said, what are you doing? And the vice minister responsible, the finance minister now, Luigi, said, you know what we're doing? What we're doing is, because of our limited connectivity, they were concentrating resource along the coast to allow growth to continue at 10%. Had they given that money to Xinjiang and Gansu, in 1993, they would have grown at 3%. So they knew that the trade-off between inequality, growth, and structural reform. So really what they did was in advance of the theory, but now they have a problem because they have too much growth along the coast, leading to congestion and constraints on production. So there is a movement back, coming again to the tax reform issues to generate structural change. So again, it's taxes driving the intergovernmental reforms. So taxes and transfers, and then the spending. So it's reversing the order from the normative theory. So this is what the Chinese did. They concentrated production along the coast. 160 million people migrated. They freed up the labor market. And they grew at 10% for 20 years. But of course, the consequence of this is that in the Pearl River Delta, you have 50 million people. This is the biggest urban conglomeration in the world. No space in Zhejiang, Shanghai, no space. You can't put an additional person with the 7 ring roads in Beijing. It doesn't make sense. So what they're thinking about is a story of sustainable growth, which is sustainable urban hubs, which is to have smaller hubs, but with connectivity. So they're able to provide for domestic demand as well as export, because previously they would only export. Now they're providing for domestic demand and exporting, but notice the hubs are here. They're not in here. Why is it no hub in Tibet? It's too sparsely populated. This is the Tibet. There is a hub in Yunnan, right next to Tibet, but with a bigger population. Will provide employment for people from Tibet. So this leads to issues about the sustainability of these hubs, governance structures, provision of services, and then there's the geographical issues about where they should be located. Same issues apply in Chile and Bolivia. And I dare say in India as well. But in India, you have additional problems of governance of big metropolitan areas, which, unlike China, are treated as any other municipality. In the Chinese big municipal areas, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Beijing, they're treated as provinces with additional responsibilities and financing. So these are key issues about sustainable hubs, and the Chinese example is extremely interesting. Where do you put them? Not easy. So really you need to be looking at how you treat the large metropolitan areas. Intergovernmental issues are critical. Financing, governance, reporting, and responsibilities all go together. So you need to be looking at how you finance the infrastructure for the large urban areas and the smaller third-tier cities. And then you need to be looking at the problem of the failure of the property taxes. Why is it so difficult to apply property taxes in developing countries? Well, it's all of Latin America, Asia, because it's a very visible tax. So what we argue in the paper, myself, Caroline Pirschel, and Giorgio Brosino, is to go back to a Marshallian idea of an equitable tax. So you link the tax to the benefit. If you have a tax that's linked to the benefit, which will also take into account improvements in property values, then you can get around the political economy, and that's why you need a different approach in financing local infrastructure. If you're able to look at local services, local infrastructure, linked to property taxes, you can get around the political economy constraints of having a property tax. But then you need access for local services, and then having a local tax means that you can anchor the liabilities built up for the local infrastructure, which is through credit and public-private partnerships. So really you need to do this, and then together with that, you need to have a framework of looking at it in an equalization framework. So, critical alignment of incentives and institution, what works, what doesn't. Look at institutions and policies that may vary according to the context. There may be interactions between taxes and between taxes and social policies. And then having the appropriate number of tiers is, again, increasingly important in both the policy debate and in the literature. And then, of course, this has implications for donors that you need, in every case, be thinking about combinations of instruments. You know, because the World Bank or the IMF or GIZ or JICA, you would have technical assistance on, say, governance, or technical assistance on certain type of tax, or certain instrument on tax administration alone. Whereas what this really shows is that all of this has to come together at different levels of government, which requires a different skill mix, and really needs to be brought in the context of informality and cheating. And that's not easy to do. And that's really a huge research agenda. And that's, you know, I mean, we've done this work on capture, clientelism, cheating, and informality in Mexico and Indonesia, but it really applies also in China and Chile, India, Pakistan. So really this is a more general set of issues showing how the policies come together. And it's when the policies come together that you have meaningful recommendations and not just recommendations in isolation. So there's a whole section on taxes, transfers, institutions, and microstability. Again, I won't go through this very much. The presentation is there. I've talked about it. That really the big key issue is that you need an own source revenue at each level of government to have any sense of accountability. And really the spending assignments may not reflect the normative spending assignments may not be appropriate in developing countries. So really you need to have accountability, which means that there needs to be linkage between taxes and transfers for the competition to work. So interactions are critical. And again, this is a modification of the diagram from Laflon. So you've got the political economy and decentralization pressure. If you have yardstick competition, you would actually move to subsidiarity and pushing things down to national, federal, provincial level. You may have a supranational level as well. But then you've got forces which are pushing things up. If you don't have proper information, you need equalization, you've got interpersonal equity issues, all this is pushing things up. It can't be done at the lower level. Similarly, spillovers, economies of scale, congestion is pushing things up. This is why education is going up in Latin America, against the recommendations of the subsidiarity principle. Then you need coordination, harmonization, cooperation. Very nice characterization of the theories and the political and practical tendencies at different levels of government. So we call this modified subsidiarity principle. Not quite what Daflon has, but I've really reflected Daflon together with other chapters, particularly those on the political economy and yardstick competition in this summary. So who does what? Really, unless you have full information on who does what, which is the IMF's Government Financial Statistics manual characterization for economic and functional categories. This is not easy. And unless you have that, it's very hard to have full recognition of the liabilities. So the IMF typically does this. The World Bank does not understand what the GFS framework is. Unfortunately, nor do many donors. And in the European case, they explicitly rejected the GFS framework, and then they ran into troubles. So really, not having the GFS framework creates problems of comparability across jurisdictions. You need a standardized framework. The IMF UN framework is the gold standard. Use it. It's not being dictated by the IMF. It's dictated by the correspondence between the system of national accounts and the fiscal accounts. These two have to mesh. That's why you have the GFS standard. Very important. It's not dictated by the IMF. So really, you want to look at the consistent information. Pointless to push down education to the lowest tier if you can't monitor it. What are you going to do if they don't pay the teachers? So a large part of the centralization in Mexico, the choice was to give fully the control of education, primary education, to the local governments or to centralize. They could not give full responsibility to provinces, to the states, local governments, because they do not control them. They also don't have own source revenues. The only choice the government had in 2013 was to insist that the teachers that they are paying for, paid for by the federal government, actually exist and can teach. They didn't know how many teachers there were. They paid for them. Sending lump sum checks to local governments. They have no idea whether or not a person exists. Quite often these people were inheriting jobs, or there's a market in the positions for teachers. It's an income. It's an income flows. Securitize the income from teachers. That's what was happening in Mexico. So they centralized it. The huge reaction requiring teachers to take an exam so that they can teach. So, but that's really necessary because Mexico is dropping down the list on the PISA scores. It's really critical. Similarly, Chile was even worse than Mexico in the PISA scores. So that was a huge political reaction, causing Bachelet to make education the centerpiece of the new strategy. I won't talk much about this. This is I've talked already about multi-level tax design. This is quite an involved issue, but the critical issue is that unless you have own source revenues at the margin, at every level of government, you get no accountability. And the problem is that donors and international agencies push responsibilities down and forget about this area. They helped Pakistan push down spending with a constitutional amendment to provinces and local governments in 2009. There's no financing. So you can even put in the constitution minimum educational standards. But you don't have enough money. You're collecting 1.5% of GDP on education that requires at least 6% of GDP. And then you're saying free education to the age 16. It's impossible. You have a tax GDP ratio of 8%. That's only enough to pay for defense and interest payments. Zero money for education. So, I mean, the fiscal accounts in Pakistan are a nonsense. So really, you have a problem unless the taxes correspond to what you're doing on the spending side. Similarly, on administration, you don't necessarily need administrations at every level of government. So the important thing is a rate-setting mechanism whereby subnational governments can piggyback on, say, central taxes, for example. A piggyback from an income tax would be very easy to do, and also provide an incentive for the states and provinces to provide information on assets and third-party information to the central government to make an income tax work properly. So similarly, on the property tax, there's a lot of issue about who does what, and it's not necessary that either the cadastre or the valuation must be at the local level. Because if it is at the local level, you get also corruption and cheating, because friends are dealing with their friends and relatives. So really, all that's necessary is the rate-setting arrangements in order to get accountability, and that opens it up. So on special tax issues, should the VAT be split? The answer is no. Nice chapters showing why it's no. And again, I've already talked about my paper with Brosi and Pershel. Links between local taxes and benefits are central. Absolutely central in getting around the political economy constraint. Example for Mexico, Santiago Levy and his collaborators were talking about the problems with applying a Bismarckian approach to social security reform in Latin America, particularly to Mexico, where the reliance is on payroll taxes on the formal sector, benefits widely funded. People cheat on the number of employees, cheat on the payroll, they cheat on the income tax, they cheat on the value-added tax. So it's cheating all around, collapse of the base, and the Mexican tax system looks like the Pakistan tax system. Collect 10% of GDP, non-ordinary. Spending 22%, mind you. It's not sustainable as the oil prices go up. So really, what the Mexicans did in the 2012-13 reforms was to block the holes of cheating. So really what they did was to turn around the model of tax administration given by the United States and the IMF into an integrated model with full information capture to stop cheating. Only designed to do that. There were 9 tax policy measures, only one contribution, only one compensation mechanism. That compensation mechanism is a basic pension, universal basic pension. And they abolished oportunidades. So we'll talk a little bit about oportunidades. So really what they focused on was the consolidation of the VAT as a mechanism to stop cheating. And this is in line with the recommendation not to split bases for the value-added tax amongst levels of government. And plugging the gaps, particularly in the income tax, to stop cheating. So really what still remains is the subnational tax agenda, which focuses on own source revenues for the states and for the local governments. However, as I said, you still need fiscal rules, And as we've seen from Europe, fiscal rules without information don't work. We have a book coming out on that, which is the EU Crisis in Multi-Level Finance. So really you need subnational revenues and full information on who does what, particularly the build-up of liabilities. That doesn't happen in Europe. There was no information. So governance in institutions, I've talked about it a fair bit. You need standardized information, and the fiscal organizational structures may look quite different in different countries. You may not have information on public-private partnerships. You may not have a treasury single account. You may not have the GFSM. You don't have these. You have a problem at the subnational level. And this is an issue which is completely ignored when people talk about decentralization. They never think about these things. It's something dealt with by the IMF. But this is critical in getting good governance and efficient outcomes. If you don't have that, be careful about what you preach in decentralizing. So, geographical issues, sustainable hubs, hugely important set of issues, which again, Ravelli surveys, leading to both horizontal and vertical competition. It's a fairly major area of econometric work. So some of you with econometric skills might be tempted to look at this. It's linked to the agenda on sustainable development. The whole area of using urban hubs as growth centers is what sustainable development is about. And then there's work on convergence in Chile and China. Of course, Ball and Lin largely give a normative approach to instruments at the metropolitan level. The point is that it needs to come back to the geographical issues that Ravelli was talking about. So generation of employment and sustainable growth. So really you're looking at both multi-level governance and institutions as mechanisms to generate growth, and that's where it all comes together. So how do you make these hubs work? So it's no point just providing a high-speed train from Torino to Naples. All it does is increase the importance of Milan. And people go from Naples to Milan. It's done nothing for Naples. So unless you begin to look at the local governance structures, just putting the infrastructure from north to south doesn't work. Pakistan is talking about infrastructure from China to Gwadar, which is going to be given to the Chinese. What's it going to do for Pakistan? Probably nothing, maybe even worse, because the Chinese goods are going to be cheaper coming into Pakistan and compete with them. So unless they have the infrastructure to build around this, this big urban, which is, electricity, water, sewage, policing, feeder roads, etc., local governments, you have mirages in the desert. You had several in Egypt, some in China as well. So really what you need to look at is where firms are likely to be based, look at cost differentials for firms. It's an issue of where private firms are going to invest. And you can think of the new hubs really as being put between the existing hubs and the export or domestic markets. And the issue really is, the question really is whether you put the new hubs between the periphery or between the extreme periphery, here or here. And this might be closer to the existing hub. Think of that A as Mexico City. The periphery is Chiapas. Would you put the hub in Chiapas? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe you put it in Chiapas, it should be there, or you put it closer to Mexico City. And the issue really will be where the concentration of population is, where you have the education, where you have the skills. And the example here is the example in Mexico of Querétaro. which is a new city, smaller, without the constraints of Mexico City, with a university, highly skilled workers, bringing in aerospace technology, bringing in automobile technology, new airport. So in a sense, they've created a new hub to relieve the pressure on Mexico City. It's closer to Mexico City. In other cases, in Chinese cases, also are closer, as you saw, to the existing hub. Would you put a hub in the periphery is the question. And the answer to that is an empirical one. And that's a very interesting research question. Where do you put these hubs? And what is required? Is it just in infrastructure? Is it investment in education? Is it provision of private or public services? Or a combination? If you don't have a combination, you don't have a holistic approach, just putting these ends will become mirages. So you have to be very careful about how you do this. The hubs and periphery story is an extremely important one in the Sustainable Development Agenda. So again, I've talked about this. So as I said, it's important for the research agenda in China, India, Latin America, Chile, Mexico, what have you. So really, all of you. Issues of lagging regions, it's all a question of overall growth and employment opportunities, sustainable employment opportunities, and sustainable development patterns. That's what it's about. So poverty reduction, excellent paper by Joachim and Regina. But also Vardhan and Mukherjee talked about clientelism, building on the paper on capture from the 2006 handbook. And the question is, does decentralization impact positively on public services for the poor? And the answer is it depends. It depends on whether or not the poor people can demand better services and whether or not the local agencies have the incentives and ability to match these expectations. And what constitutes poverty reduction and sustainable poverty reduction in the multi-level context is extremely important from the policy prescription. And the issue of local service delivery here is critical. Education plus the issue of how you would handle conditional cash transfers. The conditional cash transfers have a role to play under certain circumstances, but they may be inappropriate in others, particularly if you're thinking about compensation for energy price reforms, which was tried in Indonesia and tried again. But the problem with energy price reforms is that the impact is largely on urban middle-class households, whereas conditional cash transfers are largely to protect the incomes of the rural poor. This is what happened in the Pakistan case. So there's a mistargeting. So really, the policy context is critical. Any measure has to be critically thought of in the context of the institutions and the policy agenda in which a measure is created. Climate change and measuring and multi-level finance is a huge role for local challenges in meeting climate change, the issues of externalities, uniformity of standards and goals, monitoring of pollutants. However, there are considerable incentives to cheat, and you may need central coordination, if not central policies, like a carbon tax. So there is a balance between what is needed at the central level and what can be done and should be done at the local level, or what may have to be done at a supranational level. So really, it all comes together in the climate change agenda. And similarly with disaster prevention and relief, as we're seeing now in Nepal, in Haiti, both in terms of local building codes, healthcare, feeder roads, networks, prevention, as well as co-insurance for resolution, requires action at the national, regional, local level in advance of when a crisis hits. Plus then, as a response to a crisis. So really you need multi-level, if not supranational coordination in disaster relief. Natural resources and conflict is the story of keeping countries together and is the prime example of the political economy approaches in getting things right. So really, when you look at the natural resource agenda, the sharing of natural resources tends to be a typical response. But the question really is, would sharing increase conflict or reduce it? Would it increase incentives to secede or reduce it? The problem, and as we saw in the Indonesian case, is that with any sharing arrangement, a region that produces oil, for example, can always do better with 100%. So, with Aceh, the agreement started with 25% of onshore oil, became 35% of offshore oil, and onshore oil, 40%, 50%, 75%. So they came up with an asymmetric solution in Aceh, which was then clawed back, we were discussing this morning, through the equalization framework. However, you may get a sharing arrangement which is made completely null and void if there's cheating along the value chain. An excellent report in Nigeria showing the $25 billion stolen every year from the national Nigerian oil company. And that is a report by the Ribato Commission. You should read it. It's now on the website. Shows you how the cheating takes place at every level, particularly at the local level, before the petroleum is stolen, and before the petroleum is sold, and once the petroleum is sold. So it's at every level. The more petroleum is stolen, the less there is to share. So, people who benefit are not necessarily the poor people in the producing areas. They don't benefit. It's the elites who steal, or the gangs who steal. The poor in the receiving regions, the poor in the producing regions get nothing. So, when you have stealing, you have theft, any production sharing arrangement can be made null and void. So really what you need to do is to think about both the political economy of sharing, as well as equalization, of course, but then make sure that you have appropriate management of the oil sector. And this is a key issue in the solutions on Yemen and on Iraq, which unfortunately didn't come to fruition. So preventing ethnic and regional conflicts, excellent paper by Dower and Weber, looking at the role of transfers in minimizing conflict. But really, what we will have in reality is a much more complex. It's much more than transfers. And work that we have done on Iraq and on Yemen suggests that you're not only looking at the transfer design, but you're also looking at responsibility, you're looking at governance, you're looking at the management of the petroleum sector, making sure that there isn't stealing at any level of government, and bringing it all together. And this was in the UN-brokered peace agreement in Yemen, but unfortunately the rug was pulled from under the feet of the UN by certain parties. I will not name them. But it's still, if there's to be a solution in Yemen, it has to be along those lines. Because unless you have full transparency, efficient and appropriate sharing of resources, and equitable sharing of resources, it's not going to work. So conclusion is that you need the interaction of instruments and policies at different levels, typically treated in isolation by bilateral donors and IFIs. There's a huge research agenda around this. You really need to think through what works in Ethiopia, what works in Bolivia, what works in Indonesia. And it may be different from what works in the United States. That's a really interesting policy question. And of course, as I said, we have work which is ongoing. There's a volume on the crisis in Europe. Problems of ignoring standardized information is key lesson from this. It's impressive. It should be out in a couple of months. And then we have a China-specific volume looking at the Sustainable Development Agenda and the need for additional tax reform to drive the process. And then, of course, we have research on tax and social policy under informality, and that's ongoing and nearing conclusion. And as I said, the really interesting policy question further on is the Sustainable Development Agenda, how you create sustainable hubs, how you use those to create jobs and reduce poverty. So I'll stop.
Well, we thank Dr. Ethisam Ahmad for his appetite-whetting lecture on this big book. Etisham, you have presented a lot of materials to us, but you only mentioned the last chapter briefly. Would you spend a minute on how to measure decentralization? You said it's difficult. We, of course, don't just want to measure decentralization by how the pie is divided up between central and local government and so on. Power comes in and so on. Teach us very briefly what's state-of-the-art measurement of the degree of decentralization?
This was a key issue, Joachim, when we had established the network, intergovernmental network, which was largely for OECD countries, and it was based in Paris, and I was one of the founding members. And the first question we asked was, what do we know about who does what at each level of government and how it's financed? The trouble was that the statistics, even in the European countries and in Australia, were not sufficient to identify who does what. Because who does what is not just the total spending at any level. It's the spending which is done by, say, a local government for its own projects. You have to take out of that spending done at the local level by central government, out of its finances. And typically, you also need to identify what are tax revenues at the local level, tax revenues over which they have control. That's their own revenues. Distinct from shared revenues which they get, which are like transfers, or things over which they have no control. It could be that the central government determines the rate and the base, and the local government gets the revenue. But they have no control over it. If you have no control over the base of the tax, it's not own source revenues. Similarly, you have to identify transfers which are given to a local government as type transfers, which is, I give you 10 euros, I tell you what to do with it. You're going to use these 10 euros to build a school. Okay. You get the 10 euros, you build a school, you don't build a school. Usually you get 10 euros in Nigeria for primary education, you use it to buy cars. That's why they didn't pay the teachers. So, you can have earmark transfers, and then you can have equalization transfers, which are separate, which you can use at your will. So you need to make all these distinctions, which means that you need not only the GFS framework. The GFS framework is, in one space, it's economic. Wages, operations and maintenance, capital, investments, liabilities. So you've got all the economic factors on an accrual basis. So you're also picking up the build-up of liabilities. Then broken down by functions: education, health, environment, defense, policing. So you have the UN classification of functions. You break it down. So that's the basic information set. It doesn't exist for most countries. It doesn't exist for India. So, if you look or Mexico, the reason it doesn't exist in Mexico is that there are no standards. The Mexican states do what they want to, and you can't put it together. Okay. If you look at the GFS yearbook, it doesn't have anything for Mexico. So in a situation where you don't have this basic information, you can't go the next step, which is ask which of these is done by your level of government for your own purposes. So that's the complication.
I had hoped it would be easier.
It's not easy.
I had hoped you would give us a brief cookbook on how to measure decentralization, and then point at this country is the most decentralized in the world, and this the least one.
China is the most decentralized.
So, but you don't give us a cookbook.
There's no cookbook.
Okay. So the cookbook has yet to be written.
No, I know what's required. It's very hard to get there until you have all the institutional framework to generate the information. The Chinese have probably, and the Russians have probably made more progress in this than many OECD.
So China and Russia, the most decentralized?
No, not that decentralized. They have best information.
No. I'm asking you who is the most decentralized excessively?
China is the most decentralized, probably not excessively.
Okay.
Because it can't, roughly 85% of all spending is at the subnational level.
Okay.
But
that's much more than Germany.
It's much more than any OECD country.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily that it's only decentralized spending.
Okay.
It's all the spending takes place.
No. We understood that. It's not only spending, it's taxing power,
taxing is
earmarking, and all of that.
They have no tax coverage.
Audience, your questions now, please.
Anyone who would like to ask for more? 1, 2, 3, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I have just one comment. In all the different countries that come up as examples that you showed us today, they are usually countries that have something good going for them. So either a workforce that is quite skilled, or there's a wealth of natural resources or something like this. There were no examples of what centralization or decentralization can do for countries that have very little going for them.
I use the examples from Chile and China because those are countries I'm working in. But I do have an example for a country I'm also working in that is a bad example. It's Pakistan. It's a big country, multi-level, completely inappropriate assignments. They are thinking, sort of rote application of the normative approach, push everything down to local levels. No financing. So you push down primary education, you don't have any money for it. There's no money for electricity, there's no money for water, there's no money for public services, but it's decentralized.
So does that mean that for these countries that have very little, centralization is better?
This doesn't mean the centralization is better, but you need a proper allocation of spending responsibilities together with appropriate reforms on the revenue side. The problem with Pakistan is that it has become dependent on foreign assistance, and the dependency on being bailed out by the big powers, which you can treat as like a Dutch disease due to geographic rents. What they get is geographic rents, and you have essentially what you have are vested interests running the country that don't want to tax themselves. So you have a disastrous tax situation. They collect 8.5% of GDP, which is one of the worst in the world, spending around 22% of GDP. Someone has to make it up. And they get no space for education. They say, private sector will take care of it. Private sector will only take care of it for the rich. So in a sense, what they're doing is driving people into the madrasas. So you have a situation where you have a military operation to address the insurgency. You don't have money to even look after the people you move. This is a very innovative military strategy, to move the civilian population and go after the terrorists. They've done that, but moved 2 million, 3 million people, hit the terrorists, but then you've destroyed their homes, destroyed their livelihoods. You haven't looked after them when you've moved them into these camps. You've created another 2 million terrorists. So, you have to look at the overall picture, and you can do seemingly the right things. This is again coming back to my good friend Santiago Levy's book, which is Good Intentions, Bad Outcomes. Lots of very good intentions. Decentralize. Okay, but decentralize. You have all the financing. Hit the terrorists. You've hit the terrorists, but you've got nothing to give them. So you have a huge problem. So, bad example, but a very good one in that sense.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I just want to come back to the question about measuring centralization. From your answer, I understood that it's at the present time it's not possible to have a best indicator for decentralization. But if we look for second best indicators, which may not be best, but they can more or less reliably serve as proxies for decentralizations which we can use in different, let's say, quantitative models. Are there any such indicators you can recommend?
I'm just suggesting caution because, you know, I've seen so many brilliant econometric papers using the IMF's GFS yearbook, giving cross-country evidence on general government. General government is central, regional, local together. So you have all the levels of information, but it's wrong. Usually all you have in the GFS is central government operations. So you look at the page for India. It shows tax GDP ratio of 8%. It's central government taxes. It's only central government. They don't have state and local government, even in India, which actually has reasonably good data, even though not fully compatible with the GFS. So, you know, you use the GFS yearbook and you have all these wonderful papers, including by colleagues in the IMF. It's nonsense. So I'm just saying, be careful. The OECD work, I can tell you, was very hard. And if you look at the OECD website, they have only managed to get all the data sets for 1 or 2 years. And this is for the OECD. They haven't even begun it for developing countries. So even in countries like Germany, it's been very hard to put together the data. Australia, you know, had a very interesting political economy story. They wanted to bring in a VAT. Yeah, they replaced a lot of state and local taxes. They said, we don't want to do a VAT like India or Mexico, Brazil, split it, or Canada. We'll bring in a VAT centrally and share the revenues through the equalization framework of the Commonwealth Grants Commission. So for 3-4 years, the Australian Statistics Agency went through the fiction of calling the equalization transfers of the VAT as local revenues. It's not local revenues. It's local revenues, they had no control over it. It's an equalization transfer. So they went through this fiction. So if you start looking at Australia, put Australia in your model, you get it wrong. It's not own source revenue. Own source revenues are largely disputed. So, you know, that's the problem. You know, discussing Indonesia this morning. Indonesia has a problem in that you don't have standardized information according to GFS because you don't have the IT systems and the reporting mechanism. What they do is report to the Ministry of Home Affairs, which is administrative reporting, completely different framework. Ministry of Finance tries to make sense of it using their own approximations. So you get a completely different set of figures in the Ministry of Finance. Local governments have their own books. You've got 3 sets of numbers on Indonesia. What do you do? You may say you use one or the other as approximation. Would I sign off and say this is a good approximation? No. You treat the numbers with caution at your own risk. So you build fancy econometric models, they're only as good as the numbers. Okay. That's a warning.
Ehtisham, this seems to be difficult, as you have underlined, but India, and not only India, there are many countries who now plan to digitize all public services, all government affairs, to put GPS on all public assets, and thereby cut across boundaries, administrations, and democratize information about anything public in a nation. Yeah? So India is on that track already, with hundreds of millions of assets already tagged, and 900 million people have their fingerprinted ID. Is that a solution to cut across this problem that you face with statistics and concepts? I mean, a radically different approach to to assess, account for, and study decentralization?
It's a good step in documenting the economy. I'd say it's essential. It's not sufficient. Because remember, what this implies is that a decentralized process is where a region or a local government has its resources, which it uses itself to provide services. So there has to be the linkage between what you're spending. So you can't get away from the financial components. So what's interesting is then you're able to link the financial components, once you have them, to the outcomes. That's what this digitalization will facilitate, but it doesn't solve the problem of the financial flows.
Does it solve the problem which led you to one of the most frequently repeated words in your lecture, the word cheating?
Probably not.
Probably not.
No, because remember,
not depressing.
No, let's take the case of cheating. And how does cheating occur in Mexico? Cheating largely in Mexico is a function of, I don't know if I can draw on.
A function of? We imagine function.
It's a function of your ability to hide transactions.
Okay.
Now you're hiding transactions in employment space, profits, value added. And then you get a profit function, which you declare to the tax administration, which is like this. Then there's a true profit function, which we're able to estimate using, we were discussing this morning, of how to use, say, data from different sources, like economic census with tax data, or economic census with household data. So matching of data sets is a new industry in economics, learning from physics and biology. Matching this data set. So you find distribution of profits just way out to the right. So everybody's cheating. And they're cheating because they're able to do it. And it's transactions.
Okay.
So you can't get at that with this IT. So what the IT helps you with is, does the conditional cash transfer get to the person it's meant for? The answer is yes, it helps you with that. But we knew that already in Mexico. The oportunidades was largely getting to people it was meant for, right? Mm-hmm. But, I mean, that's not news, but what was the problem in Mexico? The problem in Mexico was twofold with the oportunidades. One is that it created disincentives to participate in the labor market and had no impact on poverty. So if you take the state of Chiapas, you've had a take-up of oportunidades which went up from around 50% when it started to around 75% today, or when it was abolished. Mm-hmm. So roughly everybody uses it, all the households. But what happened to poverty? Nothing. It was 75% then, it's 75% now. So but no effect on poverty. So it's having an effect, obviously, on some substitution between central local funds and incentives to participate in the labor market. Second issue with oportunidades was it's getting to the people in the right manner. I was in 2 states in 2013, just after the elections. State of Tabasco, state of Veracruz. Ministers of Finance from these 2 states had sent messages to Mexico City, Hacienda, saying, we've been making payments on your behalf for oportunidades for this last year, 2012. Where is the money? They said, what money? It had been sent, it had been stolen. The entire amounts had been stolen. Went into the pockets of the governor, who had built houses in Miami and Houston. Yeah. And of course the governor was arrested, but I mean, the money had gone. It was a small sum of 2.3 billion pesos, these 2 states. So there is a stealing which you don't address just by the accuracy of picking up the recipients. So of course picking up the recipients is important. And you do need to make sure that the right people get it. And there isn't cheating at that level. So.
Ehtisham, I can confess that it was actually through the working on the chapter, which Regina Birner and I contributed to your book, that we were starting to dig deeper into the functioning and malfunctioning of the generally praised conditional cash transfer programs. It has become almost a dogma that conditional cash transfers are good, should be managed centrally, implemented technically, locally. But once we had looked across the different literature on conditional cash transfers, the political economy literature, the gender-related literature, the labor market, and the corruption literature, unfortunately, colleagues, I'm able to say a different picture emerged.
It's a very good chapter.
And I think we need to take a hard look at we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Exactly.
But we need to revisit this whole
But that's
process.
true with every recommendation. You know, what works under certain circumstances.
Yeah.
You know, what works in the US may work in Indonesia under certain circumstances.
Yeah.
There are
But
conditions.
sometimes we need to
Sometimes
change
it
the
doesn't.
bathwater.
Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you do need to change it up.
Colleagues, one or two last quick questions are feasible. Oliver.
Right. You highly recommend that every level of the devolved units should have their own sources of revenues. But also, you strongly caution against splitting VATs. So how is this going to be possible? And what are these other options that a lot of the default units would be able to raise the money?
Yep.
And what is the implication? So especially some of the countries which you didn't mention here, that least income countries that are trying to now implement the devolved level of governance. Like Kenya, for instance, there are a lot of struggle between the national government and the new devolved governments.
I think this is an excellent question and really a major issue for research and policy development. I think the general lesson is don't break the base of the VAT. And that's very, very robust across the globe. Don't try and fiddle with the VAT. It doesn't work. It'll destroy the VAT, it will open the door. Remember that VAT provides information on two elements. It's wages and profits. Right? So VAT is a very good example or basis for checking on your payroll tax and your income taxes. So really, if you are looking at tax-on-tax interactions, don't fiddle with the VAT because it is going to be the basis for information. And once you have the information, then it's very easy for a regional government to piggyback on a wider income tax. Easy. You don't need a tax administration for that. The central tax administration, which uses the VAT for the income tax, determines the base. Regional government just puts 5% on the central rate. That's it. United States, that's the way it's done. So they don't have a VAT, but they have a very good tax administration, which collects all the information on the income tax. And by and large, it's very good information on the income tax in the US. And the states and local governments just have a piggyback, largely on the federal base. That's very easy to do, piggyback for both the regional and central and local levels, if necessary, for the income tax. But then there's a whole issue of property taxes. Property taxes have not worked in China, have not worked in Africa, have not worked in Latin America, largely because they've been treated in isolation. You bring in and there was an experiment on the property taxes in Shanghai and in Chongqing. Property tax on its own. Now, if you look in Shanghai, or you see Guangzhou, and you see Beijing, many of the apartments that have been built are more expensive than New York. And they're enjoying huge services. Paying nothing. Absolutely nothing. So, you're enjoying wonderful services, infrastructure, you're paying nothing. So why don't you link the payment of taxes to the services you get? So, there is an issue of equity. So therefore, you can link a proper property tax, which is really the proper base for a local government. And then you have things like service delivery and service taxes. So there's a whole range of issues, but the political economy constraint on property taxes is that it's visible. It's visible, and that's what Marshall said. It's a visible tax. Therefore, it will keep politicians honest. So if you link the provision of services by the politician to this tax, you will make sure that you get good services as well. So that's the linkage which countries have to make and haven't done because they're treating it separately.
Last question.
You have also cautioned on relying too much on the normative approach, that what works in some countries may fail in other countries. But countries who may severely affected by this one are the poor who do not have the skill to develop what works for them. They don't know how to live. That's why they depend on other country experiences, something like that. What's your say on that?
I'm not saying that you don't learn from countries. I think it's extremely important to learn from other countries and coming up with your own solution. I'm just saying that a recommendation that works in an advanced country like the US, you have to treat with caution because it may not work in a country like Ethiopia or Pakistan. So really what I'm saying is that you need to keep your eyes open. You need to design policies which are, as I said, you can do a largely subnational tax policy agenda without a subnational tax administration. The constraint on most subnational governments is tax administration. You don't need it. Even for the property tax. The property tax, there are two components. One is the cadastre. And the cadastre can be done with satellites and kept separately. It could be done by a private agency, it can be done by a government agency. In Colombia, if you go to a Colombian city, you have usually, you go to Cartagena, you have, in the old colonial times, you had, of course, you have the church, you have the governor's office, you have what was known as Instituto Geográfico Agustín Cadaci, that was the cadastre, which is done centrally. And you have the Inquisition. So in every square in Colombia you go, you have these four pillars of government: the Inquisition, church, Agustín Cadaci, and the government. So you can have cadastre done at a different level. You've got valuation. It should not be done by the locals. All that's needed at the local level is setting the rate. The rate can be set by the central government, or the band can be set by the central government in unitary states. That's what's done. In federal states, it can be left to the local government to decide. The constraints on administration and constraints on capacity are not necessarily binding.
Well,
there's technical assistance.
Yeah.
And people like you.
I don't cut you off, ever. Well, then I do it now. Maybe there are a few people who would like to have a personal conversation briefly with you. Colleagues, we currently at ZEF do work on decentralization from different perspectives in Indonesia, start work in Uganda, in Bolivia. Early on, years ago, we did our first piece of work on decentralization here in Ghana, Felix Assante's dissertation. I think this topic will continue to be with us because it matters so much for development, for participation, the opportunities of bottom-up, but also the huge problems which Ethisam Ahmad pointed out today, to have accountability and efficiency in the fiscal and economic system of nations. Ehtisham, thank you again for coming and for your book, and come again.